Already a record attendance, because the only time I've done this before is to a dog, so I think we're going to be good. I'm Dave Green. I'm a digital application systems engineer, which means basically nothing. I was a sysadmin. I now do a lot more in things like adoption and change management, basically acting as a bit of glue between the rest of the business and IT, because they talk different languages, nobody can understand each other, everybody's, 2 and 8 all over the place. So I've got a Twitter handle, website, email. If you've got any questions, obviously you can come and talk to me at any time. Because there's not many people in the session, if you stick your hand up, we'll throw this magic little soft thing. You can throw it back much harder than I throw it at you, because I want you to be comfortable, and you might want to just throw something at me. And yeah, we'll get that all sorted out, and hopefully everybody will learn something. So I started with PowerShell in about 2009, something like that, mostly with V2, generally with Exchange, because that was my big thing for a while. Then I moved into weird places like System Center and Configuration Manager, and crazy places that nobody really wants to go, like Virtual Machine Manager. So I've worked in a lot of manufacturing environments. So I used to work with a company that made salad. I now work with a company that makes Formula One cars. It's all manufacturing, but they all have very similar challenges, just slightly different days where you see what they've made. So yeah, as I said, feel free to contact me, raise your hand if you've got a question, and we'll see where we get to. So the first thing I want to say is thanks to all of our sponsors, Jonathan at the back, who's part of the organising team for this, for choosing me to speak, which is probably the biggest surprise of everything. But also thanks to you guys. This event would never happen without you. The community, everybody talking, contributing, giving back, basically. So give yourselves a pat on the back. You've all done much more, and we're just sort of paying that back here by putting on this event and speaking and, all of that sort of stuff. So thank you. Testing. So testing in general, we've got things like unit testing, infrastructure testing, all sorts of different testing, whether you're a developer, whether you're somebody that monitors machines or clusters or data centers, whatever it is, testing, whether it's through SCOM or even a simple SNMP monitor or something like Pester, everybody's got to see about the health of their services and all of the things that they're doing. Today we're going to focus very much on operational testing and how business rules can be surfaced in tests so that you can make sure that, number one, the user is served. And then you can talk about all of the other testing that you can do as kind of an additional to that, making sure the infrastructure is responding to ping or whatever it is that you're doing. So the first thing that testing has to do is ensure things are working as they should. So whether that's a ping, as Richard said in the keynote, or whether you're providing a web page, providing a REST API, a lot of the time, if you're querying a REST API or something like that, maybe it's up. But if you query it for data, you get an error message or you get an empty object. Is that very useful to a user? Probably not. So the next thing is evolve practices. So we all live in this sort of road of getting towards DevOps, but in my experience, there's a huge amount of companies that haven't even started that journey. There's so many small businesses, there's so many, I don't know, family businesses, everything like that, all the way up to, you know, fairly large organisations of 500 or 1,000 people, where their day-to-day IT is exactly the same as it was probably in the mid-90s. Things haven't changed. And hopefully, if you're lucky or unfortunate, I don't know, to work in one of those organisations that hasn't yet made that move, you're lucky in the way that you can drive that, you can take ownership of it and get everybody involved, but you're also unlucky because you're going to face a lot of pushback and a lot of challenges. But hopefully some of the things that we talk about today might help in that. So another thing is intent and context. Now, in a lot of the projects and things like that I do, the specification document generally bears no resemblance to the delivered product at the end. And that's just because features get added, requirements get glued on at the last minute, or a director comes in and says, I want this, I want it to be pink, not green, what are you, crazy? And then everything changes, but nobody goes back and updates that documentation. A lot of the time that would be somebody's full-time job just to make all of those changes to keep up with that. And testing, especially as once the kind of the cadence of making those changes to your test suites and how things should be configured, they become a living specification or a document or a place you can go just to find out what was the intent, who thought about why this was configured this way. Because on first glance, it might seem to you insane. You know, somebody's disabled the firewall on 100 machines. Like, what the hell were they thinking? You know, that's crazy. But you can go back to the test documents and everything like that and say, oh, it was disabled because of this crazy edge case bug that was done, that was fortunately later fixed with a Microsoft hotfix. So you can kind of understand where they were coming from and not, you know, burn some bridges and shout at some people, because, you know, that's always fun and never, ever comes back to bite you. So yeah, like I said, the intent and the context and that living specification, because I found that especially when you've got even a small team, so perhaps 3 or 4 people, there's opportunities for miscommunication. There's plenty of opportunities for people just not even making that attempt at communication and making a change to hopefully a test service, but perhaps a production service, to fix a problem in the heat of the moment, and then it gets left or it gets not communicated or anyone told about it, and then that somehow becomes the cause of an outage later on. Obviously, as we progress sort of within our DevOps journey, hopefully that will never be possible, because you've got that whole delivery pipeline all the way through from dev, through test, into production. But like I said, there's so many organisations out there that they're not there yet, and you've got to start somewhere. You can't wait until the entire solution is just dropped on your lap and that's it. All of a sudden you're magically DevOps and you just work in code all day. Unfortunately, there's a lot of hard graft that has to happen. And starting with things like, you know, even just testing basic services is a huge, huge win. So what's it for? Well, I've started already talking about that a little bit, but there are some really core, both psychological and team-related reasons of why testing is a good idea. So, and the first one very much is safety. So it's the freedom to experiment. If you've got a production environment set up in a certain way, and maybe you've got 1, 2, 6 different labs with different ideas of how you're going to progress that service, you've got this test suite that perhaps completely describes production. It won't always be that way, but at least you'll be able to hopefully write tests that at least get the high points, the very important pieces that are important to your users. And the ability to then take that test set and the test suite and run it against other environments, other places, other computers, whatever it is that you're testing, that is a massive psychological change in how you're thinking, because you're not worried about breaking stuff anymore. You're more worried about delivering the features and making the world better. Consistency. So you can build on this success over time. Like I said, you can't ever end up with the solution completely done right away, no in between, go from 0 to 100. That's crazy. Some people expect it, some people are idiots, because you've got to build on this over time. The biggest thing in anyone's career, in whether it's IT or probably anything really, is just that determination to do something, make it better, go back and fix the things that weren't quite right the first time and get there. Because whenever you go into an organisation and there's a guy that's probably been there for maybe 15, 20 years, that will be his defining characteristic. He's just plodding along, getting things done. That's a very admirable trait, because it's that ability to continually improve and continually do that work that sets people apart from a lot of other people that might turn up at a company, do one thing, run away to another job or another place or whatever it is, and unfortunately not document or make their solution, fit for purpose in a lot of ways. And so you can use these test suites to build and iterate on an end solution. Visibility. So once you've got a test suite, hopefully you've got enough data to start doing reports on it. You can say, okay, we had an outage on the 5th of October and these particular tests failed. We can show that we were able to understand the failure. We were able to see how it affected users, because we've been able to see from the testing perhaps particular required mailboxes or particular SharePoint sites or Active Directory users were disabled, removed, something crazy happened to them that you weren't expecting. And then you can fix that, you can show everything's green again, and hopefully the business is just as happy with you as you are with yourself. And the last thing is community. So this is community within your organisation as well as community within the entire world. Because, like I said, as soon as you get above that very small team of 2 or 3 people, you're going to have communication, brownouts, blackouts. People won't quite understand. They'll take a very literal or a very non-literal explanation of what you said. We're all human. We all make mistakes, but having these types of living specification and documentation, in the same way as the ideal of what a specification for any sort of project is supposed to be, where it's updated and it acts as your 0 point for what should be, this is another way to do that. So why operational testing? We've kind of talked about these sorts of things. There's many teams, many businesses, many services. A lot of them deal with those same sort of problems, whether it's an Office 365 migration, whether it's a move to the cloud, whether it's the next big thing. Every organisation will have its own particular things and its own little quirks, and that's where you guys come in, to be able to write those things and understand the business value that is needing to be provided, and then putting that into a way to say, is this good or bad in terms of the delivered product? And then there's those general things that are mostly cookie cutter. like Office 365 migrations, although I've seen a few that, are very, very not cookie cutter at all. So it's also difficult to monitor some services. Like I said before, a lot of organisations will have SNMP monitors. They'll have perhaps SCOM. They might have some kind of infrastructure for log collecting. But a lot of these services, in my experience at least, and please tell me if I'm wrong, they tend to ignore most SaaS services. There's a few products that do REST API monitoring and things like that, and are able to say, if I make a request to this URL, I should expect something that looks like this back. But they're generally not the products that you'll be using in most organisations, unless you're very forward-looking, because a lot of people have, I don't know, perhaps something like Manage Engine Op Manager or SCOM or something like that, where if you want to manage those SaaS services, and that includes things like Office 365, you have to do a lot of jumping through hoops to make sure that you're covering all of the bases. And testing business requirements. So something that we're moving more and more towards as IT pros is understanding the business reasons and understanding the reasons for a particular service to be available. We're no longer just looking at CPU time or memory usage or the fact that there is a network connection. Woohoo! We're looking at business requirements. So we're attempting to distill 30 people must be able to, do CAD design on this particular system at once. So some of that will be environmental, some of that will be networking and memory and things like that. Other things will be making sure that, does the database return anything? Is the web server that perhaps provides drawings or visualizations or whatever it is that is being done, does that service return reasonable data, or does it turn some kind of mishmash of broken things that are all overlaid or incorrect? Because if you don't find out, the users will certainly phone you up and let you know. And the best IT in that way is the one that is fixing the problem generally before the user's even noticed. And hopefully this will help. So there's a continuum of testing. At the very basic, we've got things like a test script. So basically a Pester test script as a PS1 file. I would hope everyone has at least written something or looked at something or seen an example where that is pretty much something that they think they could probably do. The next thing we've got in my sort of continuum, this isn't stepped. This isn't like a level thing. It's some services will have, the ability to do more automated things. Other things, different services, there will be, perhaps stuck here. Perhaps it's, I don't know, an AS400 mainframe sat in the corner that nobody's even looked at for a million years, but somehow it's part of some really, really critical business process. How do you test that? I don't know. Some IBM man came by and left these weird COBOL scripts. Okay, I don't really want to get involved with it, but because the business relies on it, a lot of the time we've got no choice. We have to do something about it. So perhaps that will be something like a test script. For other services, you might have a test suite. There are certain things like the Office 365 Secure Score. As far as that kind of covers this kind of test suite, it will let you know about things that are perhaps insecure or not as good as they could be. And that's kind of what we'll be talking about, that sort of level today. The next sort of thing in my crazy continuum of how things are working is something like a compliance scan. So we start to get into something like really the sort of beginnings of things like DSC and very comprehensive monitoring systems like SCOM and stuff like that, where you've got history, trending, it automatically runs. You don't have to specifically think about it. You just get an alert when something goes wrong. And then the last one is compliance management, where you start to get into things where you've got automatic resolution of problems, which is awesome. You know, you've got full state configuration. You can blow away all your servers and redeploy them all exactly as they were before. I mean, if you're at that point, then, you know, I've probably got nothing to even begin to teach you, because I'm very much kind of around here for a lot of things. So, and hopefully this will be quite helpful for you, because there's a few things that are out there in terms of PowerShell that do this sort of stuff. There's the operational validation framework that kind of provides a bit of a framework for Pester testing to allow you to do scheduling and reporting and sort of a framework that you can use. And Test Business is kind of not an alternative, but something that you can use as well. I'm not particular with tools or anything like that. You know, pick the best tool for the job. Don't listen to me. Figure it out yourself. So for test-driven operations, I generally have a few things that I just go to first. And that's what I'm testing is less important than why I'm testing it. If it's something that doesn't affect the business, does it need to be there? Am I just writing code for the sake of it? Am I testing things like, I don't know, I'm making sure less than 1,000 processes are running on this machine? Why? You know, you've got to be very selective with what you're doing, especially when you're working in teams, because the more code you write and the more that you have in, you know, test suites and PowerShell and all of that sort of stuff, the more opportunity there is for people to get lost and decide, I want to go back to the way it was, you know, because it's easy. It's easy not to change. And putting that change out there and making that the way forward and the better way is difficult, and unfortunately we have to make a few sacrifices to have that happen. But testing the reason for it is the most important thing. The second thing is keep things public. Not necessarily world public, but, you know, at the very least team public, perhaps business public. Involve everyone that is important to that service. So if you've got project managers, if you've got perhaps expert users that have their own opinions on what should be, you have to talk to those people, because they are the people that drive what you're going to test. There's no use it goes back to that first point. There's no use writing those tests if they're not going to be used by anything or anyone. Working with existing change control processes, because this is around test, we're less worried about this, but it's always important to understand as you progress to things like automatic resolution or even guided resolution for certain problems. If you're alerting on problems in production, you have to work with the existing processes. The best way to get in trouble is to start making changes without going through change control if you have it, because there's a lot of people that will be knocking on your door and shouting at you. And incremental improvements and marginal gains. Like I said, you can't get to the end solution straight away. You have to even start with something really, really small, like the server process is running, woohoo. And then you can go to the server process is not hung. You know, it might be there, but it might not be serving users. And you can step that out and work it forward. And then eventually you'll be, before you know it, in this completely different world where you're testing or you're managing all of your infrastructure in this new way. And people will just think, you're a genius. How did you do this? But all you've ever seen is these little incremental moves that have been simple to you. And so you might think, well, it was nothing. All I did was change this one thing, and then all of a sudden I've got auto-remediation across all of my estate. But people don't see all of the work that comes in behind that. And that's the most important thing, especially for a sense of achievement for you, at least. So test business, it runs TestSuites. It was pretty obvious by the name. All it really does is wrap Pester. And from the looks on most of your faces, you know what Pester is. You've probably used it, or at the very least, had a little look. It ships with Windows, in Windows 10. You might want to update it because there's a few nice features in the later versions, but there's nothing more than that, what I'm doing today. There's a couple of helper scripts because something that I've noticed with the reason I wrote this, in the whole reason for it was, I had a few colleagues that were, I was kind of trying to get on the whole Pester bandwagon to test a few things. And they were thinking, well, maybe I can use it for some of these Office 365 migrations I'm doing or something like that. But then they have to start implementing scripts or functions or whatever it is to connect to Exchange so that they can run the tests. But how do you make that a way? How do you make that so you can package that up and then pass it to somebody else and then they can run it? And that's kind of where this came from. It allows you to package up sort of that whole piece as essentially a unit of code that you can distribute to your team members or around the business to give them a way to run all of those tests that you've so painfully and over a long time built. It generates some shiny reports. That's a little bit of thievery because I'm essentially, when you run the function, invoke report unit, if you don't have report unit, it goes and downloads it and then runs it against the NUnit XML that Pester generates for you. So I've not done any work, but I'm leveraging things that already exist because I've had a look at what XML Pester generates, and if you can make sense of it, you're better than me. There's some crazy things in there sometimes. I've started to try and delve into it for some better metrics that I can put into something like Power BI, but I'm not quite there yet. And maybe that's something that you guys will take away and do yourself. And if you do, please let me know because I'll be your friend forever. So yeah, like I said, that just uses report unit. There's a couple of bugs which I'll mention, but they're not major. And then it writes a test summary as well, which is another function that's in that module. And really all that is doing is looking at the very, very top of the Pester XML, where it says how many tests passed, how many tests failed, how many tests errored. Because, like I said, it gets a bit complicated for me. I'm not an XML guru. So that's test business, and that is a module all of its own. So that has a few functions in it that allow you to run test suites. And it has some of these extra functions that I mentioned. So what does a test suite look like? Well, all I'm doing is using a PowerShell module, the same way that everything else is distributed for the gallery and things like that. And then I'm using it as a vehicle, just a block of, a box that I can put all my code in and then run those test suites against. Essentially, it's a way for me to figure out where in the file system this thing is and an entry point to get into run things. It has a certain structure, so it uses sort of this test suite framework that I kind of dreamt up. It's not really fixed in any way, but generally what happens is you've got your module folder, and then inside you've got a data folder that holds data files, a helpers folder that holds those scripts that allow you to connect to services, perhaps load data. Maybe you'll be passing in credentials into those functions, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. You've got a tests folder that holds Pester test files. And then you've got, like any module, you've got a module description and a PSM1 file. Now, for the vast majority of all of the TestSuite modules I've ever written myself, that is empty, because it's not a module, it's not a standalone unit. It's just a way for me to distribute all this stuff in a way that I can get team members, other people around the business, or perhaps even people that don't quite understand what's going on. They can download the module, run the test suite, it tells them what's wrong, and they can go and fix it. So it provides a way to make it easy for most users. So we can talk about helpers, data, and tests. So there's a single helper entry. So what that means is, I'll go into it in a little bit where we talk about the structure a little bit more. But for each helper that exists, there can be multiple data files and multiple test files associated with that. And that's mostly to break things up, because if you've got a large service, I'm probably going to go back to the Exchange Online example, you're probably going to have a lot of tests in there. And that means you're going to have a lot of data that you're testing things against. How do you expect things to look? Do you expect things to be, are you going to go really deep with the testing, in which case you're going to be identifying and having whole objects in the test data. And that gets pretty long and is quite difficult to pass if there's 1,000 lines of it. So what this allows you to do is create a bunch of different data files, so maybe one for mailbox tests, one for transport rule tests, one for organizational relationship tests and sharing and federation and things like that, and just so on. Perhaps one for unified messaging or whatever that is going to become. So the helper name is used as the key for data and tests. Basically what that means is I'm looking at the helper file, taking the name of that helper file, and then finding any data or any tests that include that name. So there's a couple of odd edge case bugs that exist around if perhaps you've got a helper called one and then another helper called one thing, because one thing contains one, things are going to get weird. But it's something that I know about, so I don't do. Also, because I'm comparing against things like the full path, which I should really be only comparing the bit in the module, don't ever name a helper users. That causes a lot of problems. So I've got a handy little function called get test suite data, and it shows the helpers, it shows the data, and it shows the tests. So it's a good way of understanding what you're going to be running in any particular situation. So I've talked for way too long. Let's have a demo. So we're somewhere around there. Cool. This is going to be fun. Right. So if I run that. So I've got I've got 4 modules essentially that I'm going to be showing you today. So one is test business, which is the thing that runs the tests. I've got a couple of basic examples that really are just to show you the structure. And then I've got a cut down example of an Office 365 test suite that I use to test a bunch of things to do with just the general health of how things are going. Because Office 365 might be up 99.9% of the time, but I can guarantee that all of your service, users, they're still going to phone up with problems. It might say, I can't get to this mailbox. Well, you don't have permissions to this mailbox, but I had permissions to this mailbox. What's changed? I don't know. And then it goes around in this crazy circle. So, like I said, we're concentrating very much on the user service point of view rather than is it up? Because Office 365 Microsoft do a much better job than I could ever do for making sure that services are up. Whether they return useful data, that's another thing entirely. So I've installed all these modules, and I'm going to run get TestSuite. So this is really just a wrapper around get module. All I'm actually doing is running get module and returning results that contain .TestSuite at the end. And it's just a way for me to signal that this is a test suite. It might not be ideal. My initial thought was to perhaps work with the module type and magically change that, but that was difficult. And like Richard said in the keynote, we're here to get things done. We're not here to, lose ourselves for a whole year just trying to make that word script change to test suite or something like that. So I went with a slightly easier option. It works for me. Hopefully it works for other people too. You can also specify a particular path to a PSD1. So if get test suite will only ever return results of modules that are in your PS module path. If the module is not discoverable, it will never show here. So if I uninstalled some of these modules, they wouldn't show. But I can specify the exact path to the PSD1, and it will, again, it will do that same job and understand that it's a test suite module. This is just an example that shows if I import the module, all I'm doing is basically wrapping get module to understand this thing, because there's no exported commandlets, there's no functions. What the hell does it do? A lot of modules don't look like this. It's just because it's a vehicle to distribute that code. So we can use this basic example and then run the get test suite data commandlet against it. And what this does is it delves into that module, looks into particular folders. So the helper path is always going to be under helpers. The test directory will always be under tests. It loads in all of the data that it can see, and that just happens as a PS object. When there's multiple data files, like I said, it just iterates through them, loads them all into an object that's provided there. And this data, when you run the test suite, this data object is just passed into the test suite so that you can understand which tests will be run. So you can see the name of the test suite, the data directory, and then a test path. So you can see that this particular one goes down to the point of referencing an individual file. Now, in this example, there is only one file. In the other examples, there are more, and it will make a bit more sense. It has an environment of none. And that is because, if I show you over on here, once I can figure out how to navigate things, if I look under source, and I look under data and tests, all I have is files directly in the data in the test folder. The test business module has an ability, if there are directories directly under the tests and the data folder, you can have specific, not tests, that's crazy. You want the same test for every environment. You want different data and different helpers for each environment. So if you have a folder under data and a folder under helpers, it will load in a particular environment-specific data set. So perhaps you might be testing on a different network, or you might be testing with a debug version of the application that has weird names in all of the executable paths and stuff like that. It's just a way for you to use the same tests against multiple different environments.
For example, so if you had a blue-green deployment service, you could turn around and have blue-green as the data in the helpers.
Yeah, so the question was, if you had a blue-green deployment service, you could turn around and test both of those different environments. Yeah, pretty much. I have, as we'll kind of get onto later, I might have removed it actually from the Office 365 test suite, but I definitely recommend you always have either a demo or a test Office 365 environment to test things in, because users don't like it when their email goes away. Who knew? It allows you to, just iterate on those kind of things. So I'm going to run the test suite. So if you've ever seen Pester before, this is kind of the output that you would expect. All I'm doing is invoking the test suite, specifying the particular test suite just by its module name. And then in this example, I'm showing all of the test results. By default, it will only ever show fails because all that green stuff, that just means I'm doing my job. I don't need to do anything about that. Let's manage by exception and talk about the failures. So I've specifically gotten a very complicated example here where I'm describing two services. So the BitLocker engine service is running, and Win32 time, I expected it to be running, but it stopped, which is good in my example, but bad if I was actually expecting the service to be running. And then I've got a required processes are running here. If I look at the Pester test file, it's like you would expect in any particular normal Pester test situation. I'm using a test case here, but there's not anything magically complicated about it. The only thing that I'm potentially using that isn't immediately obvious is this variable test. Where did it come from? That test variable is poked in by invoke test suite. So you can look at all of the data. So if we scroll back up here, where we see this data, we're describing the services and the process state. I can access all of this data just by using that test variable, which is quite a nice little way that I've, it's not special, it's not difficult, because Pester is running as a child of invoke test suite, and I'm just defining that variable there and passing it all the way through. But it's very useful in many, many different situations. Right, so we can close that. We can go to our next example, which is hugely, hugely more complicated. So you can see here that I've got a few different things when I've run get test suite data for this second example. The actual tests themselves, they're not really any different, but I've just got a little bit more adventurous with how I'm organizing the files. So you can see I've got a prod and I've got a test environment there. Now, because, like I said, the helpers are used as the key, I'm having to actually create blank files in the helpers directory just to say this is some tests that can be run. And then we can run that as well. And so we actually see pretty much the same output in that we're testing the same services. But we're only testing a production environment. So where we got the test suite data, you can see that these environment things, rather than saying none, they've started to reflect the structure that I've set here. Wherever that was. Yeah. So I've got prod and test here. So I'm testing both processes and service data. So I've got the object that describes what I'm testing, and then that's the helper. Let's expand out tests. But I've only got one set of tests because the set of tests should always stay the same. It's very important for that to always be the case because you don't want that weird configuration drift that we talked about earlier to start infecting your test scripts as well. So we'll go back. So we've got the ability to test these two different environments. So if I run it in test, you can see when I've run it in prod, I'm testing BDE service and Win32 time. When I run it in test, I'm testing BDE service and the Xbox Game Save service, which is much more important to me in the test environment because how am I going to play Call of Duty on my test environment servers without that? Yeah, so again, it's just a way for you to use the same tests to test all of those different pieces. There's also the ability to exclude particular types of test. So you can see that I've got both process tests and service tests. Although I don't seem to be running the process tests here for some reason. You can exclude a particular category of tests. You can also include a particular category of tests. So if you exclude one, it will run everything but that. If you include one, it will only run the ones you've specified. It's a very simple filter. And then, in the same way, we've got the ability to just run report unit against that. And that's Chrome over here. So all it does is run report unit. If you don't have more than one class of tests, it can't find the file to open for you. But you can see we've got the process tests and the service tests. And we've got a fail there, and one green, one red there. When I was talking about the bugs in report unit, I don't know how it gets 12. I don't know whether it's concatenating or whether it's just multiplying things by other things, and there's probably a magic number in there somewhere. But we don't really care about that because we're more focused on what's red, what's green. And you can see here that there's some nice little graphs. So you can say, oh, this bit's green. You know, I like this bit. And then this bit's red. What do I need to do? And it gives you the direct data from the Pester output, which is really awesome. I've used this exact report, not this exact one, but this particular report with my managers' managers. People understand this because it's not a command line. You know, a lot of people, they see some weird red and green stuff on either a PowerShell window or somewhere else, and they just immediately switch off. This is a much more friendly way to communicate about that. Something else it will also do is just by I think it's by default, I can't remember, but it will write out a little CSV that just says how many tests there were, how many things passed, how many things failed, and a percentage of what happened. And this is Exchange Online. So this is a nice little teaser of basically what comes next. So I have this is a bit cut down, this test suite, because it gets a bit complicated once you've sort of been at this for a little while. And something that's quite interesting that I didn't really realize is when I built all these examples for here, I had to take out a bunch of modules and things that I use that aren't public, because I wanted anyone to be able to run these things. And so I took out some credential remembering modules and other things like that. Better credential or something would be absolutely fine to run in. And then we can run this particular example, which is the Office 365 test suite. And I need to provide it some credentials because I haven't remembered them. And I'll run that. So what this will do is the helper will actually connect to Exchange Online using the credentials I've just given it. And it will basically run through all of those tests that I've specified. Now, everything I've shown you here, plus obviously all of the code, all of the bits and bobs, you can see there's a few different pieces of code here that is being tested. All of that I will put up on GitHub in the next 24 hours, hopefully, assuming I can manage that. This is really just a taster session to kind of get the point across and how that's, what's good, what's bad, everything that's going on. So where did I put those reports? So if I go in here, let's just reveal that in Explorer. So you can see I've done these a huge amount of testing about mailbox auditing and stuff like that. Hopefully some of that will be dealt with by Microsoft later on when they finally get around to enabling auditing for everyone automatically. But until then, those tests will be useful. So I've got a couple of minutes for questions and things like that. And obviously, after the session, in the breaks, at lunchtime, if anyone's got anything, about this or not about this or about anything really that they want to talk about, please, I'll be happy to talk to any of you about all of that. So, any questions?
So why do you use the helper as the key rather than the test as the key, which then go off to the helper and the data that way?
Right, so the question was, why would I use the helpers as the key rather than the tests as the key? Because in a lot of cases, there are so many tests, and you want to split them over a load of different files, it becomes very difficult to understand which bit of the name is the important piece. And I didn't want to make it opinionated enough that you had to put the right bit at the right part of the name, because it would be quite easy to get yourself into a bit of a muddle, which is why it all keys off that helper. So that helper can call other files because it's just PowerShell. When you're dealing with things like Pester, when you're dealing with things like the PSD1 documentation piece, that is, you want to be a bit more constrained with how you do it. You don't really want to put loads of boilerplate code in your tests, because then you'll get into a whole other set of situation where you try and go across environments, because then you'll have to start checking all of that. When you're dealing with data, there's only a couple of variables you can use. You can use true, false, null. That's basically it. You can't do PowerShell in those data files. I initially did start off with the data files being the keys, and I learned my lesson. Lots of pain. Do you want the...
Go back to the code screen.
Okay.
You've got a folder for service.
Yes.
Why have you done that?
Yeah, so this is...
Rather than just having the service as PS1.
Right, so the question was, why have I got the service folder in example 2? Yeah, so we have here. So the reason I did that was more to show how it's basically a dumb string comparison along the path, to show you how it loads in the files. It's an option that you might want to be able to do, because especially when you have loads of files, like when I go to the Office 365 one, when you have lots of tests, you want to start breaking it up, and it makes a lot more sense for the way things are just laid out. Like you might have a small file just for Azure AD or something like that, but then when you get to this, it helps with the folders and things. Cool. So, I mean, we're pretty much done for time. Like I said, just come and corral me. You know, tell me what's good, tell me what's bad. I'm sure there's a way to feed back to Jonathan to never ever let me come back here and talk.
Forms, if you could pick one of those up, it will take you literally 5 seconds to fill it out.
Cool. So I'll be there filling out the feedback forms for myself. You know, but it's been great to come and talk to all of you guys. And like I said, thank you. You're what makes the community great. So, yeah, congratulations.